Hey guys, it's Abel here with the Sustainable Self-Development Podcast. And in this episode, I'm coming at you with something kind of new that I wanted to do for a while, and that is a best-of episode of sorts with some of the most important lessons from past podcast episodes. So frequently when I put out a new episode, I'm thinking to myself how awesome some of the concepts that my guests shared here are, and how I wish that everyone would hear these bits and pieces. And then, as it often does, it just kind of gets lost in the ether. I mean, podcast is a long-form content type genre, and a lot of the tiny bits and pieces will not be heard by as many people as I would like them to be heard. So I decided to do these episodes every once in a while where I pick some of the most important parts of some of my favorite episodes that I think will be informative or valuable to you and can offer some good insight. And so how frequently I will do these episodes really depend on the feedback and how you like these and how much of these you'd like to hear in the future. So have a listen and let me know at the end what you thought of the content. And if you liked it, let me know and I will make sure to do more of them. In this episode, I will share 4 bits of content from 4 really respected guests and some of my all-time favorite episodes. And the guests that I will feature will be Dr. Mike Israetel, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, Eric Helms, and Menno Henselmans, who will discuss different topics. We will start with Dr. Israetel, who will discuss why the evolution-based reasoning and the paleo framework can be problematic when it comes to nutrition and fitness, because oftentimes you will hear things like, well, how could saturated fat be bad for you in excess amounts when it's being consumed all throughout evolution? And you'll hear a lot of similar adages which seem to make sense logically, but there are a couple of holes in this reasoning and a couple of caveats that it doesn't take into account. So Dr. Mike Israetel will shed some great light on these concepts. So with that, let's hear what Dr. Mike has to say on this.
When paleo people, CrossFitters, when they eat huge amounts of saturated fat and they're in unbelievable shape, you're not too worried about those people. However, when someone's eating a really shit diet and they're eating a lot of saturated fats in addition to that, and they're out of shape and they're saying, oh, it's a myth that saturated fats are bad for you, they're going to pay for that. They're going to pay for that for sure. So it's better to know all of that stuff so that you don't make these really ridiculous mistakes rather than just go out of ignorance and say saturated fat's not that big of a deal. I'm always of the opinion that it's good to give people all of the information on what affects their health. And if they choose to ignore some of the little minor stuff, great, but it's good to know. So I'm not going to ever say that saturated fats just aren't bad for you at all, unless that's what the literature ends up revealing, which is unlikely at this point because there's so much literature on it already. I'm never going to say it doesn't matter. I'll just say, it doesn't matter that much. But if you're really interested in perfecting your health, it does matter. And just to end on a kind of a little bit of a sentimental note, you got grandchildren running around and you want to see them from age 3 to age 4. All of a sudden you look back at all that bacon and shit you ate and you're like, damn it. Maybe 6 months is really valuable. To a person on their deathbed, 6 minutes they would give all of their money for. So is it good to know maybe that there's a trade-off? Totally. Now, do you want to make it? Maybe not, because someone could be on their deathbed and be like, okay, if you never ate bacon, you'd be another year of life. They'd be like, yeah, but it's a year I would use eating bacon anyway. I fucking lived a good life. I love bacon. I love saturated fats. It's awesome. I love cheeseburgers. And peace, I'm out. See you in the next world. That's totally cool. As long as they know what they're doing, that's fine.
Yeah, and I guess also on a evolutionary medicine kind of framework, because many times the argument is that, well, it doesn't make logically any sense that some substance that had been present all throughout human evolution could be harmful, but what that argument doesn't account for is that it hasn't been available throughout evolution in unlimited amounts, which is what we're talking about here. So.
Oh boy, that argument doesn't account for all kinds of stuff. Other than that, you're completely correct in that it doesn't account for unlimited amounts. What also doesn't account for is that considering that longevity is even a very high selective pressure in our evolutionary environment. When the average age of death was 30, can we really think that something that kills you when you're 65 would even be selected against? True. You know what I mean? That's a crazy thought. There's a variety of things about our bodies that are not designed for longevity at all. the very things. So for example, a high intake of calories, a high intake of saturated fats makes you resistant to disease. It makes you bigger. It makes you stronger. It makes you more energetic. It makes you be able to hurt people better and have sex with people better and survive up until age 30, when you're the alpha male and you stabbed everyone else in the face and you've gotten laid a ton, you've left a ton of ancestors as progeny, and then finally you break your toe on accident and someone sneaks up on you and guts you like a fish because they want all your women. That's what evolutionary ancestral environment looks like. Cheeseburgers are an enhancer in that environment. The more of you can have, the better, because there's very huge shortage of calories, and saturated fats are huge in brain development and in hormones and everything that you need. So they're good for you in that environment. We did not evolve in an environment unless some kind of weird agrarian culture where we all rode bicycles and there were solar panels everywhere and we lived to 100. That wasn't a thing. So, if something like a cheeseburger could make you a baller until you were 35, and then after age 50 it started to exact some health effects, that would be hugely selected for during our ancestral environment, because almost no one made it to age 60. You know what I mean? So the idea that we evolved for health in the long term is already flawed, and it's not just unsupported, it's actually backwards supported, right? We know for a fact that much of human evolution was designed for age under 30, under 35, and after that your body kind of just like, there's not much purpose for anything that happens because you probably should be dead. Right? So when they say like, Alzheimer's, like, how come that error occurs where Alzheimer's occurs? Well, Alzheimer's usually doesn't develop until your 60s. So the number of people in our ancestral environment that actually lived long enough to have Alzheimer's is so small that it's kind of irrelevant for evolution. You know what I mean? Like, how come there's no evolutionary mechanism against Alzheimer's? Because you already accomplished everything that's evolutionary relevant. By the time you're 60, you're probably dead, right? Only now are we seeing the people living past 60, and Alzheimer's is probably an example of just the brain not being designed to be that old. That's it, So, and there's a bunch of other stuff like that. So now that we are in that environment, we can't really look to evolution to answer questions about what we should be eating. We should look to direct scientific evidence to look what should be eating. Does that make sense? So we should say, okay, given what we know about human condition now, what foods eaten now are going to give us the results we want now. And people say, but in ancestral times, well, that's not ancestral times. The goal isn't to be a warlike monster or a super reproducing machine up until age 35 and then get killed by somebody or have a toothache that turns into an infection that kills you within 3 days, right? That's ancestral environment, not very instructive for the modern world as far as longevity for sure is concerned, and pretty much as far as health is concerned either.
Yeah, man, that's a brilliant point, because usually the argument is that you look at the paleo framework because that's what we did all throughout evolution, and we should abandon all the modern stuff. But basically, the whole concept of living very long is already a modern construct. So
exactly, that is exactly true, and it also. There's some fallacious reasoning, and there's a little bit of the naturalistic fallacy, a little bit of what's called in sociology, the noble savage myth, that, back in the day, things were good. The Paleolithic sucked. It sucked in almost every conceivable way. People were worse off in almost every single measurable way. And the reason they weren't worse off is because of really nasty other things. Why were there almost no fat people back then? Because they were fucking starving all the damn time. There's no fat people in Africa either, but you don't exactly try to move there to be like, yeah, this is a great life. It sucks that people are trying to leave, right? So it's one of the situations where, the sort of mystification, idealization of ancestral times is just radically off base to begin with. Almost everything about the modern world is better, and we had better understand what kind of dietary practices are more conducive to health. Some of them will, for some reason or another, correlate to ancestral practices, but some of them won't. And it's funny because if you actually ask cavemen what they want, if you gave cavemen a sample of foods, they would only pick fast food. Fast food is universally accepted as the best possible food. Why? Because it has the most saturated fats, the most sugars, the most calorie density, because that's what was most lacking in our Paleolithic environment. That's what people wanted the most because it was damn near not around. As Paleolithic, as we had Paleolithic ancestors, most of our brain still functions like that. That's one of the big reasons why we're so fat and so because we're so lazy, because movement isn't something you want to do. Ancestral humans aren't naturally hard workers. You would die if you were a naturally hard worker because you would expend so much energy doing pointless activities. naturally supposed to just want to eat junk food, as much of it as possible, because it brings as many calories as you can stuff in, because starvation is so always around. And then the other thing is you want to be as lazy as possible, because only when you need to move to survive should you be moving. Otherwise, you should be conserving calories. So the real paleo individuals, they will be the fattest, laziest one of all of us. So, modernity brings with it its own challenges, but also very good things. It's best to evaluate it on a current scientific level of what is it about our bodies that's a good idea for us to eat? How should we be physically active? Let's just stick to that. And whatever happened in the past, very, very different conditions and not optimized for our health and wellness back then.
All right, hope you enjoyed this clip from Dr. Israetel. And with that, let's jump into a different clip now with Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, whom I interviewed about a year ago and talked about the ketogenic diet and its implications in various settings. And I asked him the question that seems to be neglected and overlooked quite often amongst people who advocate the ketogenic diet, which is the role of calorie intake and the importance of how much you eat and how important it is to maintain a healthy body weight. And the reason I asked him this is because the ketogenic diet has a lot of health benefits in terms of reducing inflammation, improving cognition, and things like that. And some people almost go far as to say that it is fine if you overeat and it's fine if you're overweight and you shouldn't care about fat loss and body composition because the ketogenic diet is just so healthy for you. And so I wanted to get the take of one of the biggest experts in this field on this topic. And so with that, let's hear what Dr. Dominic D'Agostino has to say.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, as I mentioned, I think the ketogenic diet helps us auto-regulate our calories to match our energy needs. So it's very difficult. I'll put it this way. It's very difficult to gain weight on a ketogenic diet. And I get a lot of feedback from young guys who know the benefits of the ketogenic diet for promoting weight loss, for getting lean, from if the guys that work out. And when they try to gain, a lot of muscle as fast as possible on the ketogenic diet, they try to overeat the ketogenic diet. And at first they're able to do it. And then they lose their appetite. They almost get nauseous by all the fat and everything. And I feel that, a surplus amount of calories on a ketogenic diet is just as bad, maybe even worse than surplus amount of calories on a high carbohydrate diet, because it's going to elevate blood levels of fats. Whenever you're, exceeding the amount of calories that you need, you're going to be, elevating your blood levels of fats. And that could eventually cause, fatty liver, the fats get oxidized and they could do damage. But you're just less likely to eat surplus amount of calories if your diet has a macronutrient ratio that's similar to a ketogenic diet. It just becomes very difficult to overeat. But I do think, and Thomas Seyfried really believes that the ketogenic diet could promote even cancer growth if it's consumed in excess amounts. And he actually demonstrated that in his animal model of brain tumor. But it's important to realize that the ketogenic diet that he was administering, I think it was the Keto-Cal supplement that had hydrogenated fats. It also may have had some sweeteners in it, like aspartame or other artificial sweeteners, which caused the mice to eat excess amounts. So they tend to, he gave it and let the mice eat ad libitum. And I think that the composition of the diet, from the things that I mentioned previously, the hydrogenated fats, the sweeteners, caused the mice to eat more than they otherwise would. And he saw rapid tumor growth in an unrestricted ketogenic diet. So we formulated a ketogenic diet that didn't have artificial sweeteners in it, and it had a healthy complement of fat. It had like medium chain fats and some, had flaxseed oil, combination of saturated, medium, and monounsaturated. And when we did this in 3 studies we've published so far, and when we gave the diet, ad libitum, we actually saw it caused pretty dramatic reduction in tumor growth and metastasis, and it also increased survival significantly. And so I think it matters what kind of diet you formulate. Most of the ketogenic diet practitioners out there and clinicians, they're very good. Some of them are very good neurologists, and they're very good at what they do. But they don't have an appreciation for the subtleties of the diet. And when it comes to formulating the correct ratio of fats, protein, and the various, diet formulations, I think would be optimal. And that's where it really takes the skill of a trained nutritionist. Beth Zupac-Kania, who works for the Charlie Foundation, which is a foundation in the United States that promotes the use of the ketogenic diet. Miriam Kalamian, who's a dietitian that does a lot of work with cancer patients, are sort of like my go-to dietitians. When people come to me and they say, well, can you formulate a ketogenic diet? I'll connect them to various ketogenic diet savvy dietitians who know how to formulate the diet precisely to get a particular benefit from it. So as ketogenic diet researchers, it's really important for us to all be using sort of a similar version of the ketogenic diet.
All right, hope you enjoyed this other clip from Dr. D'Agostino. And so with that, let's hear another clip from another highly respected guest, Menno Henselmans, a guy who is so often featured on my YouTube channel and my podcast in various iterations. And I asked him about the concept of building muscle and losing fat at the same time. I think he made a big push in the industry towards making it an accepted notion that body recomposition and gaining muscle in a caloric deficit is indeed possible. And now I asked him to describe just what is the role really of energy balance when it comes to building muscle. In other words, how important it is to eat a caloric surplus when you want to gain muscle. And after that, we transitioned briefly into nutrient timing, and he shared his views on the importance of making use of the so-called anabolic window. And spoiler alert, it will probably spark a lot of disagreement, which is fine. That's why we're here. So let's go ahead and hear from Menno. Two sides of this. One end of the spectrum says that, no problem, you can recomp and gain all the muscle you can in a deficit. And the other side kind of says like, well, if you're a newbie or you're very overweight or you're new to proper training, then maybe you can. Could you just, for the listeners, outline just how important is the whole concept of energy balance for muscle growth specifically?
Right. So the impact of energy balance on muscle growth, it exists for sure, and it's a dose response basically. So the difference between a 20% deficit and being at maintenance is quite significant, but then if you go into a 5% surplus, you get additional benefit. But if you then go, say, into a 50% surplus, then you're getting into the level where at some point all of the excess energy that you're consuming is just going to pile on as fat tissue because you've maxed out your rate of muscle growth basically. Now, theoretically, maybe there's always some incremental return, but at some point in practice, it's just so small and not worth the fat gain anymore. But this impact, this general effect on energy balance, on protein balance, and ultimately muscle growth is far smaller than many people think. And in fact, there are lots of studies that do not find any difference in the rates of muscle growth, even though they study diets with a different energy content. And we have a few sort of direct studies on this, especially Scandinavian literature, that actually looked at this directly on the rate of muscle growth as a function of energy balance. But we also see this a lot in research on protein intake that is often not controlled for energy. So there, for example, we see that groups that consume a lot more protein and energy do not actually gain more muscle mass, even though they consume both more protein and more energy than the other groups. So it's definitely a high understated, an overstated relationship, basically. So you not only can gain muscle mass when you're in energy deficit, the difference between how much muscle you can gain versus when you are in energy surplus is actually not that large, but it does exist.
Right. So actually, okay, I'm in a big dilemma which question to ask first. But first, You mentioned that you've had a 8-month-long bulk and you tracked your body composition very meticulously. And by the end of 8 months, you concluded that you gained 1 pound of muscle. Do you think you could have gained that 1 pound of muscle given the elite training advancement that you are at in, let's say, a 5% deficit?
A good question. Could I have also gained that pound of muscle without bulking? I think not. In fact, this is largely anecdotal because, as I said, the research doesn't really support this at all. But anecdotally, I think you come at a certain point when you are really advanced and you are bordering on touching your genetic limitations in terms of muscle mass, that you get to the point where the body simply won't grow anymore at all, basically, if you are not in energy surplus. And it's basically where you get into, people always say like the fine tuning is the final 10%, and you hear Pareto rules, about people say you get your protein in, you do strength training, that's 80% of your results. Anything else you do is the remaining 20%. May well be true for a novice level lifter, but what a lot of people experience is that they simply stop growing at all. And I've been stuck. If I look at my own progression over the, 12 years or something I've been training, then there are many periods where evidently I did not grow at all. And I was getting my protein in, I was training hard, my diet was composed of whole foods. I had the very basics right, but there was just no further growth. So I think you get into this point where either any growth that you obtain is lost during your weight loss periods, or you are simply not growing anymore at all. So you're actually looking at threshold effects and not diminishing returns effects.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up because in your PT course, one thing that we learned about extensively is how, as you get more advanced as a trainee, nutrient timing and making use of the anabolic window, as they call it, it becomes increasingly important. Now, my question to you would be, do you think it would be a fair statement to make that for an advanced lifter like yourself, or even less advanced, getting the workout nutrition right could be just as important or even slightly more important than being in an energy surplus across the weeks for muscle growth?
For sure. Actually, there's a study by, I think it's Holmi et al., 2005, 2016, or 2015 or 16. I think it's 15, that directly at groups that made this comparison possible. And they found that the protein timing was actually the more determining factor of muscle growth than total energy intake. So I think absolutely this is the case. And I mean, if you think about it logically, you think, say you have two trainees and one of them makes sure that it's like the traditional bro, gets in his protein shakes, the post-workout shake, pre-workout shake, whatever, even if it's not fully science-based, has 6 meals a day and only eats white rice, broccoli, chicken. So he's basically cutting nonstop, or at best he's at maintenance. And the other trainee consumes a lot more energy by bulking, but he trains first thing in the morning and consumes all of the energy in one meal at night, at dinner. I think intuitively almost everyone would agree that the person with the one meal at dinner and training in the morning is not going to be as successful as the other.
The audio here cut out, but he said that the person eating one meal a day will not be as successful than the other person having nutrient timing better dialed in and eating overall less energy. Right. And I'm glad you brought up a hypothetical study scenario, because that's just what I wanted to ask. Like, let's say we have two groups of advanced trainees, same body fat percentage, everything is the same, but one is in a 5% surplus and the other one is a 5% deficit. But the 5% deficit group has the workout nutrition dialed in, and the other one has a completely suboptimal nutrient timing, let's say, very suboptimally spaced out. So do you think that the workout nutrition group would gain more muscle?
Yeah, in general, yes. Obviously, it depends on the specifics, because if you're looking at one group that is consuming a whole meal 2 hours before their workout and another whole meal 1 hour after, and the nutrient timing group also has a shake in that period, then probably you're not going to find major differences, if any, because the whole period is already covered with hyperaminoacidemia, so the presence of sufficient amino acids in the blood. So then, there is no more additional effect. But if you're looking at like a more extreme scenario, like what I was talking about, then absolutely.
All right, guys. And with that, let's hear the last clip for today from the one and only Eric Helms, with whom I did one of my first ever interviews, and it's one of my all-time favorites. And we discussed a whole bunch of topics here. And in this particular clip, we will talk about Eric's first bodybuilding season and his experience with the so-called post-contest binge, where bodybuilders tend to fall off the wagon quite badly if they're not careful. And he didn't really have a solid plan exiting the diet and exiting the contest prep, and he experienced some pretty horrendous weight gain and recurring binge episodes. So he tells us how he dealt with this situation and what it took him to actually overcome it and how long it took him to actually get on the right path again. So let's hear this clip from Eric. I think it will be very insightful for a lot of you.
So would you mind telling that story? Like, how did that happen?
You know, it happens to most bodybuilders, I would say, their first season, or most stage physique competitors, right? I had a very meticulous plan for how I was going to actually diet down for the show. To my credit, I did pretty good for a first season. I didn't have a great physique at the time. I'd only been training for 2-3 years. And I didn't get completely shredded, but I definitely showed up looking like I belonged on stage. And it took me from January to May. So I dieted January, February, March, April. I dieted 5 months, which at that time, 2007, when there wasn't the same kind of push for a more intelligent approach to it, that was considered a very long prep. Now it's kind of like when I hire someone 5 months, I'm like, oh, you better be really lean to start. It's not very long, believe it or not. But anyway, so I had a plan to get there. My plan to get out was, well, I've always been fine with it. I'm naturally a skinny kid. I've never had, I don't even know how to get fat. So whatever, my plan is going to be a list of restaurants, but I didn't have any way to know the extreme drive for overconsumption of food, and that swing back effect where you can actually overshoot your fat levels. The amount of stress that I'd be under trying to diet down, a lot of it unneeded by the way I was approaching things. I was doing a lot of wacky stuff, like I wouldn't combine fats and carbs sometimes, and I had a food list of about maybe 8 foods that I would eat, and I was eating maybe 6 or 7 meals a day, and all that on top of a pretty hectic schedule and life in general. And I was a wreck by the time I got off stage, and it just turned into basically a recurring binge episodes. And I would try to then have low days to try to make up for the binge day, and eventually I just gave into it. I was like, it's more stressful for me to try to manage the fact that I'm binging all the time. I'm just gonna eat until I'm not hungry anymore. Unfortunately, eating until I wasn't hungry anymore meant that 2 months later I'd put on 48 pounds. And I looked up one day and I was like, I competed at 178 pounds and now I'm 226. Like, I couldn't believe it. I had never been 226 pounds in my life. The heaviest I think I'd ever been was maybe 205, 210. So I managed to put 15, 20 pounds on more than when I started my diet just 5 months prior. So, and 2 months after the diet was over. So people had heard, who I hadn't seen in a while, I'm meeting up with, friends from high school, and they're like, oh, I heard you did a show 2 months ago. And they look at me like, did you really do a show 2 months ago? Because I looked like maybe a lineman in American football rather than someone who just did a show only in May and it was July. So, I run into a lot of people who for a large portion of their life before they even got interested in competitive bodybuilding have been very focused on looking lean, and they're always trying to stay lean, and they go through these kind of periods, and they look up and they contact me because maybe 4 years out of their 5 years of training, they've been in a cutting state or trying to maintain a very low body fat. That I see a lot. But other people who get into bodybuilding, they have been trying to gain weight forever, and they don't necessarily have that background. So it's a huge surprise when they deal with that. And it's not necessarily losing my condition or putting on fat that really freaked me out, because I never really was concerned about my body image that much. I got into lifting weights from an odd kind of place. It wasn't necessarily like, I'm not happy with my body, I need to change it. It was more like, I'm not happy with my life, I need to do something. And I just fell in love with it. So for me, it was much more the mental side of it. The fact that for the first time in my life, I couldn't control what I wanted to eat. I did not want to binge. I was clearly doing something I did not like, and I just felt completely out of control. And you can imagine, for someone who is drawn to control to do a bodybuilding show, the stress of feeling like you can't control something that you can control for 5 months. Like I would I weighed out my peanut butter to the gram, and now I can't only eat 2 slices of pizza. I have to eat the whole pizza. Like, that made me feel weak. That made me feel like I was a fraud bodybuilder. It made me feel like there was something wrong with me, like I had an eating disorder, and I probably technically did for a little while there. So the emotional state was more related to, like, what the hell's wrong with me? I feel like I'm crazy, and just lack of control. And I think that was the big one. It really just felt like I didn't get to choose where my life was going, and that was not a comfortable feeling for me at all. One of the things that helped me get out of it was actually reading about the Minnesota semi-starvation study, which is, for those who don't know, in the 40s, Ansel Keys did a study, a famous researcher, on how to get people who had starved. So, like, we're talking POW and even Holocaust survivors back to a healthy body weight. So putting a bunch of men on half of the calories they needed to maintain weight for 6 months straight in a controlled condition. So they were basically locked up, so they couldn't do it. It's not the kind of thing that would pass an ethics board today. But it's one of the pivotal pieces of research that has informed us about what happened to people's diet. And there was some wacky stuff that happened. Like, some people became professional chefs after the study was over. One guy apparently, I think, cut off his finger. I could be misquoting at a certain point in the study, and that's how he got out of it. There were people who broke out of the controlled conditions they were in and binged at like basically a commissary kind of thing. Everyone was showing signs of, at the time, the way they diagnosed, because there's different diagnostic criteria for eating disorders. So everyone at the time could have been diagnosed for anorexia. I don't know if that's still the case based on the current diagnostic criteria, but it showed that some of the things that we see as an eating disorder aren't just the behavior, they're where you get to physiologically. And all of a sudden it started to make sense. I was like, yeah, I'm more focused on food than anything else in my life. Like, I'll be talking to my wife, and then I'm like, yeah, and I'm thinking, I have no idea what you just said because I'm thinking about lunch. I know it's coming up, So the food focus and the lack of control really started to make sense when I read about this group of guys going through the exact same thing I did, a 6-month period, or almost 6 months in my case, of getting down to as lean as your body will let you get, and then, seeing what happens, and I saw the same thing they did, and I just happened to have the benefit of a modern society where I could look it up on Wikipedia and feel a little less crazy, which was actually extremely helpful. And I was able to get my proverbial shit together after that.
Yeah. Obviously this made you a better coach. But do you think it changed your relationship to food and, things like that?
Yes. And I would say it took me until maybe 3 years ago before I got back to what I would say would be a naturally healthy relationship with food. And I'll explain what I mean by kind of telling a story. So I started dieting for that show in January 2007. That's when I started tracking nutrients, weighing foods, tracking my macros for the first time. I didn't actually stop tracking my macros until 2012. So that was 5 years of weighing and tracking foods. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that I didn't go out to eat with my wife or eat out at holidays or take days off tracking the food, or revert from macros to just calories, or maybe make a 48-hour window where I could hit it. But I was always tracking, and when I could, I would weigh it out. In 2012, I kind of realized, I'm going to be moving to a new country. I'm not going to have access. And I had a discussion with my wife, and she was like, you're great about doing it in a way that doesn't affect me, but just the fact that you're doing it, to be honest, I don't think it's necessary, and it's kind of weird. And I went, it is kind of weird. That is, it's fine for me. I'm making it happen. But like, Berto, Jeff, Brad, my colleagues, they're like, we don't track macros to that degree in the off season. We keep it in check, but do you really think you need to weigh out your oats every morning? That kind of thing. Like, do you not know what a bowl of oats should look like? So now I got to New Zealand. I was like, do I really need to do this? I've heard that the body actually has a way to regulate body weight. I heard it's called like hunger and satiety. Wouldn't it be nice if I could actually start to use those signals again? So for the last 3 years, I have just been eating as I want and just basically keeping mindful of the things that I habitually don't keep in place in the off season, which is under eating. Because I get to a certain point and I just lose my hunger. Like right now, I'm maintaining about 201, 202, reasonably lean. But if I try to get any heavier than that, or even try to maintain that, I just kind of basically what will happen is I'll end up just cyclically accidentally cutting because I lose my hunger signals. So I have to ensure that I eat enough, and I have to ensure that I get enough protein in. So I track a few things. And to be honest, if you track for 5 years, you can't not know where your calories and macros are roughly. Like I can always tell you about where I'm at for the day, and sometimes I'll check it. And I'm always right. Like, for example, I'll give you 2 examples to show you what 5 years of macro tracking does to your ability to kind of see the zeros and ones in the matrix kind of thing. A buddy of mine had a yam on his desk, and I said, hey, I think that's, or it's called a kumra here. I said, I think that's 63 grams. And he was like, what? I was like, I bet you that's about 63 grams. And he was like, shut up. He put it on the scale, and it was 62 grams. So, and then he did. I did it again just to show that it wasn't like a magic trick, like just a fake thing. It wasn't a fluke. And then also another example would be I participated in a study for a 16-week diet tracking study. We used MyFitnessPal and tracked, and it started with a 4-week baseline period. And the researcher who I was working with was like, we're just going to track your baseline calories, and you'll come in, and then we'll go from there. And I said, I think I'm probably taking in about 2,800 calories on average, and I bet I get about 2 grams per kg of protein. And he said, okay, well, we still got to track. And I said, okay, sure. So at the end of the 4 weeks, it comes back. Average calories are 2,741. My protein intake is 174, which is just barely under. I was at 90 kg. So I can't not know where I'm at, but I'm not chucking everything on the scale. I eat anywhere between 2 to 4 meals a day. I eat out as much as I want. So I'm actually using the skills I learned rather than let them being kind of like a crutch or training wheels that I just don't need anymore. And that is something that I actually could encourage my athletes to do in the off season, is get down to tracking the minimal amount of variables to be consistent rather than all of the variables, which is more appropriate just for contest prep,
Yeah, it's 2 quick points I want to make off of that. Is one of them is, I think if we're talking about flexible dieting, I guess that's all cool and fine. But I think for a lot of people, the more you include these quote unquote junk foods, the more accurate you have to be with your measuring, because the less you can rely on your natural satiety signals, right?
That's a great point. I mean, the foods that we consider quote unquote junk, they are a component, not all of the obesity epidemic, because they increase satiety more than they blunt it by eating it. So people tend to overeat, and they're packed with calories. When you have a really, really high fat and high sugar item, the average person, even with some nutritional knowledge, will guess, and they'll be like, oh, it's probably 200. They're like, no, that's a 600 calorie cookie. And you're like, what? So it makes you more likely to be off, and you can't trust your natural signals as much. So you're 100% right.
All right, guys, so that was all the clips from Dr. Mike Israetel, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, Eric Helms, and Menno Henselmans. I hope you enjoyed this, and please let me know what you thought of this. Just comment or reach out to me in whatever way you prefer, and let me know what you thought of all of this and what you liked, what you didn't like, maybe what kind of content or topics you'd like me to include when I do an episode like this again. And if you enjoy my podcast as a whole, then please leave a rating on iTunes, and you can follow me on SoundCloud as well. If you just search for the Sustainable Self-Development Podcast, you can find me on both platforms. And if you watch this on YouTube, subscribe to receive content like this once it comes out. And you can also check out my blog, where I put up every blog post, every YouTube video, and every new podcast episode. And it is susdvc.com. It is susdvc.com. It's actually meant to stand for Sustainable Self-Development Center.com. but I just made an abbreviation. So thank you guys for your attention. Thanks for hanging around until now, and see you next time.